Good evening and welcome to Solutionary TV. I am your host, Dr. Tatiana. Do we have the answers that humanity is seeking to our global problems and our global issues? And Solutionary TV is discovering again and again, one guest at a time, one segment at a time. Yes, in fact, we do. Tonight is another journey through consciousness. It's another journey through understanding what can really truly be the catalyst for so much change in humanity, overcoming some of these massive hurdles that we have within our systems. And it really starts at the level of consciousness. We have a phenomenal guest with us tonight, and I would love to tell you all about his accomplishments before we bring him on the air. We have Dr. Eben Alexander, and let me tell you a little bit about him and why his information and his wisdom is so deeply relevant. After decades as a physician and a teacher at Harvard Medical School and elsewhere, renowned academic neurosurgeon Dr. Eben Alexander thought he knew how the brain and how consciousness worked. A transcendental near-death experience, known as an NDE, during a week-long coma from an inexplicable brain infection challenged all of that completely. Memories of his life have been completely deleted during that coma, yet he awoke with memories of a fantastic odyssey deep in another realm, more real than this earthly one. Since 2008, his NDE that took place at that time, he has been reconciling his rich spiritual experience with contemporary physics and cosmology. We are conscious in spite of our brain, is his belief. By probing deeply into our own consciousness, we transcend the limits of the human brain and of the physical material realm. His story offers a crucial key to the understanding of reality, the human consciousness, from which he wrote both Proof of Heaven, A Neurosurgeon's Journey into the Afterlife, and Map of Heaven, How Science, Religion, and Ordinary People Are Proving the Afterlife. A pioneer scientist and thought leader in consciousness studies, Dr. Alexander has been the guest on Dr. Oz, Oprah, and many other media programs. We're honored to have him here tonight. His most recent book, Living in a Mindful Universe, A Neurosurgeon's Journey into the Heart of Consciousness, co-authored with Karen Newell, explores brain consciousness, relationship, and incorporates the tools he has assisted to bring to the public in Sacred Acoustics. Welcome, Dr. Alexander.
Well, Tatiana, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's such an honor and a privilege. As we were sharing prior to coming on the air, we were able to meet briefly at one of the many conferences that you attend as a speaker, sharing your story. Your story is nothing short of profound. It has always felt to those that have listened and commented on it that it was almost a soul contract, that you chose to allow something so rare and so devastating as the affliction that you suffered with in your spine, the full infection, and then the E. coli meningitis, if I understand correctly, and then to have experienced what you did with the wisdom of a neurosurgeon, a neurospecialist, recognizing that DMT dump, the depletion of oxygen to the brain, all of the typical things that experts in your field would have tried to assume might have led to that particular experience, that deepening, expansive consciousness experience in another realm, just didn't fit the model. And so I know that we've got so much to share tonight, but if you could just touch on how that massive rebirth for you really motivated some of the work that you're doing now in recognizing that level of consciousness and the being accessible to those realms is such an enormous part of your life and your drive at this point.
Well, it really was an incredible gift, and I think it was a perfect example of something I've come to realize very deeply in this journey. is that the hardships and difficulties in life, they're the engines of our growth. And so this meningoencephalitis that I had back in 2008 was a tremendous gift. And of course, it wasn't apparent as such to my family at the time. There I was in 3 hours, driven deep into coma, spent 7 days in coma. Um, Without any sign of any kind of neurologic improvement or coming back to this world. I started that week with a 10% chance of survival. By the end of the week, my doctors estimated I was down to a 2% chance of survival. And of course, when I did start coming back to this world, my doctors were right. My brain was wrecked.
Mm-hmm.
I had no words or language when I came back to this world. I didn't even recognize my mother, my sisters, my sons standing at the bedside. I had no idea who these beings were. All I knew was where I had been, and that was that extraordinary spiritual journey that I described in Proof of Heaven. It was a journey that if you'd asked me in those first few weeks how long I was there, I would have said months or years. I don't know. It was an extraordinary, extensive odyssey. This is not some little flash in the pan. And of course, I describe a lot of that in Proof of Heaven, and we expand even more on some of the other talks I've given, and also in Living in a Mindful Universe, the newest book, we expand dramatically on a lot of kind of what I witnessed and then how we've come to realize what the lessons were there. But it was extraordinary, especially, and this is the reason I'm often asked to speak to medical and surgical groups, because I shouldn't have had any experience at all.
Right.
My doctors knew from my neurologic exams, from my lab values, from the scans that showed that the meningoencephalitis affected all 8 lobes of my brain. No region of the neocortex, the human part of the brain, was spared at all. So my doctors were very confident when I came back to this world, and they were shocked that I was coming back because they thought that was pretty much an impossibility. But they assured me that I couldn't have had any experience because that part of my brain, the neocortex, which modern neuroscience says is essential to at least some part of it, must be working for any kind of detailed conscious awareness. And yet they had evidence that mine was quite heavily damaged and that no part of the neocortex was still working. And that's why it was such a gift. Now, of course, initially I just believed what my doctors told me, that the dying brain can play all kinds of tricks, and I just assumed it had to have been a massive hallucination. But that was before I realized just how sick I was. And that was also back when all of my neurosurgical, neuroscientific knowledge still had not come back to me. Words and language came back very rapidly over hours and days, childhood memories over a week or two, all of my semantic knowledge, all of that knowledge from more than 25 years spent as an academic neurosurgeon, my knowledge of physics, cosmology, chemistry, biology, every bit of that came back over about 8 weeks. To this day, my doctors would tell you it's an absolute shock. They have no explanation for how I had more than a complete recovery, which is exactly what I have benefited from. In fact, what I came to realize in the months and years after my coma is that a lot of the memories that had returned so completely by 8 weeks post-coma were more complete than they had been before my coma. And that part to explain to people because it belies the falsehood of our neuroscientific notion that memories are stored in the brain. And that, of course, something we go into in Living in a Mindful Universe, is the fact that modern neurosurgical and neuroscientific knowledge basically supports strongly that memories are not stored in the brain at all. But that's such a nail in the coffin of scientific materialism that it is not yet trumpeted on the front pages, but we discuss it in detail in Living in a Mindful Universe. You don't find memories stored in the physical brain. That's a huge clue that physicalism, the conventional scientific knowledge that the physical world is all that exists, must be a false view.
Yes.
And that's where all of this gets far, far more interesting. And that's what Living in a Mindful Universe is all about. That's really what all of our presentations and discussions are about now, is this awakening coming to the world over the whole issue of consciousness itself.
It must be, thank you for that. It must be really exhilarating as you're following the science, because my next question is going to be talking about some of these new scientific and medical models around the brain and consciousness and some of the leaps and bounds that we've had. But quite a bit of it's been in the press. We do understand now from a quantum physics model that it has been demonstrated and it has been made academic and peer-reviewed and published that out of 100% of what's there, only 4.7% is what we would call the material world or the real world, the world of matter, which then belies how much in the space that we cannot see within the human visual acuity, within human visual range, actually is there. I think they're talking about 22% of that is matter, and the rest of it is dark energy. So dark energy, dark matter. And how much of that is influencing us. So there's a place for that fantastic odyssey in that space that we would have called nothing that turns out to be the vast majority of what's there. Let's touch on that a little bit. What are you finding as you're following the academics and the emerging science around the brain and consciousness and where memories are stored?
Well, I think the important thing to point out to people, and this is the case that we make very strongly and completely in the book Living in a Mindful Universe, but that is an acknowledgement that as much as we're tempted to think that there's that world out there, I mean, I look around me and I see this home that I'm sitting in, look out to the trees and the lakes and the mountains in the distance, the stars up in the night sky. And turns out, though, that what you're experiencing has never been anything other than a representational model within consciousness of a world that we assume is out there. Now, of course, the mind and brain are so good at this that they convince us that here we are in these physical bodies and we're existing in this three-dimensional spatial world that progresses through time in ways that make the material world look to be very much alive. But we've never experienced anything other than the inside of our own consciousness. And that cannot be overstressed in terms of where you need to start in terms of unraveling all this. And that consciousness, the other part of it, of course, is we tend to think, and our scientific revolution over the last 400 years has been trying to play this game of being the scientist wandering through this world as if the world didn't depend on the mind of that scientist. And that's where quantum physics has very clearly shown us that you really cannot separate the observer from the observed, that these boundaries of self in many ways are very false. And in fact, the leading mystery of quantum physics, the measurement paradox, that really is kind of mind-blowing in terms of its strength. And when I talk about that, I also talk specifically about Einstein's kind of concerns about locality and local realism. And then John Bell, the Irish physicist in the 1960s, who came up with a way to address Einstein's concerns that had been expressed in the 1935 EPR paper that Einstein wrote. But Bell came up with a way to address that so that you could experimentally assess it all. And the experiments that had been done since the early 80s through just the last year or so to confirm this and show these relationships keep pointing out something very crucial. And that is, there is no objective physical world out there independent of the observing mind. And I can't say those words strongly enough. There is no such thing as an objective physical world out there independent of our mind. It's all working from within mind. Consciousness is what generates all this. And shocking and strange as that might sound to people, it's really the way the scientific community is headed on understanding the mind and brain and all of these relationships. And the essence of it, and the piece that I think even a lot of neuroscientists miss, is once you acknowledge that all of my perceptions of this world are really what I'm experiencing. I don't experience the world itself. I experience my perceptions of it. And we realize that those perceptions, according to modern neuroscience, all of my thoughts, all of my everything I see and hear and smell and touch, every bit of that neuronal information coming in, it is absolutely all within that model of consciousness. All those perceptions, if we agree with modern neuroscience, that every bit of that must be due to neurons and the action of neurons in the brain, the 100 billion brain cells that are part of our thinking, you've also got to realize, and this is the part where modern neuroscience kind of drops the ball, that every one of those neurons is a quantum computer. They
Right.
are working with ions and ion channels tightly confined so that the momentum of those ions is very much opened up. The uncertainty, because of the tightness of confinement in spatial channels, as well as in synaptic vesicles where the neurotransmitters are released, every bit of that is a quantum processor. And so our perceptions of the world are every bit
Mm-hmm.
quantum.
Right.
You might say, well, when I look out at this mountain out here, and I can't really envision its moving as mind over matter, but the perception of it can absolutely be shifted, and that's where I think this revolution is so critical, is to understand that as you come to acknowledge that the perceptions of the world and thoughts about the world are really the only thing that we have to go on. The physical world itself doesn't exist. Quantum physics tells us that very clearly.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really kind of helps to step up to the plate to realize that all of these neurons functioning as quantum computers are simply allowing consciousness to express itself. And so all this physical universe emerges out of consciousness and not the other way around. And once you start to get that, which is kind of the deepest lessons of some of the great seekers and mystics of the most exciting and innovative kind of religious and spiritual traditions going back thousands of years, and we start realizing that these are all powers of individual humans to harness, then you start to realize that this evolution of understanding of science and addressing this mind-brain relationship in novel ways enables each and every one of us as a sentient being to learn a lot more about how we can manifest the free will of our higher soul, manifest the world of our dreams by coming to realize that we do have power
Mm-hmm.
over these kind of perceptions, over these thoughts, and this kind of awareness of the universe. We have tremendous power in determining how it comes out. Now, we've known this for many decades, if not centuries, in the medical world through what's called placebo effect.
Exactly.
Mind
Mm-hmm.
matter. Very, very powerful example of how consciousness is what creates all of reality. The fact that people can have tremendous placebo effect, even to the point of eradicating advanced stage 4 cancers,
Mm-hmm.
eradicating infections, completely clearing birth defects, things like that, cerebral palsy. There are multiple examples of advanced levels of disease that can then be completely undone due to our beliefs through
Exactly.
placebo effect and that kind of thing. And that's where I think the world is really awakening to the true power that we have as sentient beings in determining the world of our dreams. And that's where this awakening that we're talking about in living in a mindful universe is so extraordinary and exciting.
I want to support, where you're going with where it's already been demonstrated that consciousness is really what creates that reality, and that conscious is not located in this meat suit, as I've heard it crudely referred to many times, and that the meat suit is mostly empty space anyway. But let's talk about where it's already existed in society. We know that the shamanic traditions have always understood this and have used with sacrament and plant ceremony to have a better understanding about the fractalized multiverses with which we coexist. We know that even our own military and declassified, and under the Freedom of Information Act has demonstrated that they've been involved in astral travel and remote viewing. What is that but in one's internal consciousness projected outside of the physical vehicle into other spheres of consciousness, and with great success, by the way, and espionage and spy programs. And these are just things that have been going on for quite some time, probably long before the United States stumbled into it. I would say that, for as long as humans have existed, we knew that we were not relegated exclusively to our physicality. So I'm excited hearing the applications that you're now witnessing coming about in the circles that you have an influence on. Let's talk about what consciousness can do when we have a practice, and as that is applied to working with the brain. We do know that we want to be in friendly use of the brain. We don't want to be in occipital lobe, old reptilian brain, fight and flight all the time. How developing a very active pineal gland, prefrontal cortex, working with different aspects of hemisync and binaural beats and getting into meditative states to work on our own graduated and accelerated forms of consciousness can be really greatly enhanced with some of these tools that you're working on. I may be jumping ahead a little bit, but I don't think that it can be understated. Living in a mindful universe really leads up to this apex of, and here is a way that we can help you. Let's talk to Sacred Acoustics for a minute.
Yes, well, it's interesting that you bring up the whole remote viewing, the psychic spy programs of the 80s and 90s and all that. Just yesterday, I was reading some material from Jessica Utts, who was the statistician who was in charge of a lot of that parapsychological research, and in fact, she was recently the president of the American Association of Statisticians, more than 6,000 members of this group. And in her presidential address, she talked about parapsychological psi experimentation and basically pointed out yet again that the findings in the field, the findings of the scientific study, of those government programs, remote viewing and that kind of thing, were extraordinary in their showing of the reality of psi and of paranormal experiences. And Jessica Utts, it was interesting in this one piece, she was talking about a presentation she gave as the president of that organization. And in that presentation, she said that she often presented tremendous amounts of data to statisticians when she was discussing parapsychological phenomena. And then she would get to a point where she would ask the audience, well, what would convince you? More reams and reams of more data that fully supports this,
right,
or a personal experience that showed you beyond belief the reality of it. And she said almost without exception that the audience of all these statisticians and scientists say we want the personal experience.
Yes.
That would convince us. And that is really what it boils down to. And that's a central message in Living in a Mindful Universe, which, of course, I co-wrote with my life partner, Karen Newell, who is the co-founder of Sacred Acoustics. I first met Karen back in November 2011. She knew nothing about my NDE, and the book hadn't come out yet. Nobody really knew the story of my NDE. But we hit it off immediately, and I understood that she had spent a whole lifetime basically honoring a worldview that I was just beginning to realize is the best way to look at reality. Mm-hmm. And that's a worldview that we discuss a lot in Living in a Mindful Universe. It's called metaphysical or ontological idealism. It's basically the notion that the entire universe is mental, that everything emerges from consciousness. And as strange as that might sound to people, it looks like the answer. Mm-hmm. It looks like what quantum physicists from Wolfgang Pauli and Werner Heisenberg, Paul Dirac, Louis de Broglie, Erwin Schrödinger, and others were trying to steer us towards that 80 years ago, because the findings of quantum physics so strongly suggested that consciousness was fundamental in the universe. And yet we'd spent, the 300 years of the scientific revolution trying to believe this fiction, an assumption of the scientific revolution, that the physical world is all that exists. And that if somehow you can understand all the rules governing the workings of that physical world, especially when you break the world down into the tiniest little parts of subatomic particles and then build them all up and assume that bottom-up organization is going to explain everything that occurs in our world, we end up with lots of problems and gaps and things that don't work, and all the problems with materialist science. And this especially comes to the fore in the world of consciousness, in trying to explain the relationship between brain and mind. And of course, this is something we go into in great detail in Living in a Mindful Universe to dissect all of this out, because quantum physics should have led us out of that morass 80 or so years ago. And yet what you find is the scientific community has continued to struggle over the very deep mystery of quantum physics, the measurement paradox, and this fact that the observer seems to be absolutely essential, and that you cannot separate the observer from the observed. And this is where Karen and I go in Living in a Mindful Universe, is start discussing alternative models. If the brain is not the producer of consciousness, then how are we to look at the brain and mind and their relationship? And really, there's a model that's been around for more than 100 years, filter theory, where you basically assume that consciousness is primordial, is fundamental, just as physicists tried to tell us at the beginning.
Hmm.
But the scientific world has been slow on the uptake. But if you take that assumption that consciousness is fundamental, look at the brain as a reducing valve or filter that limits that primordial consciousness down to this little trickle of the apparent existence of a sentient being. And I will say that that little trickle of consciousness is only the tiniest little bit of the big C consciousness, which is the mind that generates all of this universe, that God consciousness. And we're all part of that.
Hmm.
By meditation, we can go within and start to develop our relationship with that much broader big C consciousness, that universal mind, that primordial mind that determines all that comes into this reality. And that is something that Karen and I discuss a lot in our meditation play shops, in Living in a Mindful Universe. Also, I would encourage people who want to learn more about this, you can go to ebenalexander.com, EBEN Alexander.com, to my website. And right there on the front page is an invitation to join your 33-day journey into the heart of consciousness. It's a free email course. I would encourage everybody to participate. It has a translate function so that people from all around the world can participate in this in comment sections on each of those 33 days. Each day is devoted to a specific concept that is a major part of our book. And this is all really a way of building a community of helping people go within, realize that this filter theory of mind and primordial consciousness is a very empowering set of concepts. And it begins with each and every one of us as an individual sentient being, trying to work our way through this universe, especially in this crazy world in which we find ourselves today, with this worship of materialism, all the kind of crazy fake news out there, when in fact the answers lie within us all. And to take charge of our lives, to gain a much greater insight and sense of connectedness with ourselves and with others, and with that divine source, that universal mind that generates every bit of it from the get-go. Going within is the way to do that. Meditation, realizing that the voice in our head, that little voice that lives in my my temporal and frontal lobes in the dominant hemisphere, that is not who I am.
Right.
That thoughts is not my consciousness. And so that's where all of this gets far more interesting. When you realize the little voice in your head is no more than, as Michael Singer puts it in his book, The Untethered Soul, he calls that voice in your head the annoying roommate. I love that. Because
Yes.
it is little more than that.
As I recall, Eckhart Tolle was having the same kind of annoying experience with his own inner voice when he had his major breakthroughs prior to the birthing of his great work. And I just want to speak to the 33-day program, Eben. I did actually participate in that as kind of a primer to being able to promote that in introducing you on the show. So through my Facebook groups and some of my followers with Solutionary TV, I can say it's an exceptional program for those that especially enjoy having the content rich provided to them and even marrying it with some of the introduction to Sacred Acoustics.
Right.
It really was a really complete program, and 30 days plus is what we need to make some differences and changes in our lives, isn't it?
Thank you. I will credit Karen Newell with that 33-day course. She came up with this a few weeks before the book launched. And I was initially a little confused about it, like, yeah, I guess that could work. But once she put it together, and then when I saw people participating in all the comments and everything growing, it's a beautiful community, and it's a wonderful way to get this out to the world. No soul left behind. Yeah. This whole world is waking up.
It is. It is.
Everyone to be part of that awakening, because it's incredibly liberating and refreshing and invigorating for every individual soul to come to these kinds of realizations about the nature of reality. And not only that, but of our influence on this evolving awakening of the destiny of humanity, of which we are all a part. So this is a very exciting time to be alive, and in spite of all the kind of dire headlines and the crazy fake news and kind of insanity of our front page view of the world, I find tremendous cause for optimism. in where I believe this world is headed. And that is really because I have great faith, trust in the universe, and also a great trust in all of my fellow sentient beings out there and the awakening that we are all participating in bringing to this world.
Well, I'm so encouraged by your enthusiasm, and I think that for those that may have missed it, this science that you're speaking of now may not be showing up with the major, networks and the major newspapers and syndicate. We're slow on the uptake. For the seekers, you can find it. You can find it on the internet. You can find it in literature. You can find it in some of these corners. You can find it in media platforms like this. We just had a major announcement. It was a global announcement in the same arena with which we're talking about tonight, Eben, which is, consciousness and how much actually exists in that space that we would now call the fractalized multiverses. We just had an announcement that 70 years, and I'm assuming and believe that it's far more than that, but recently it came out, 70 years plus of documentation and secret projects and a whole lot of money through the Department of Defense, the CIA, the NSA, Lockheed Martin, is being declassified. We've known about other beings or other craft aerial phenomenon, but they are discussing the fact that there is also an understanding that there is intelligence that may not be exactly in the form that we have all come to appreciate as humanity. This is exciting. It's time to stop seeing through such small, narrow, and locked box lenses and realize that the opportunities for healing are exponential. The opportunities for connecting with galactic family could be very well exponential. And our ability to manage our own consciousness so that we can manage the growth and the harmonization of the consciousness of humanity is very important before we can get off this rock, wouldn't you say, Eben? And really take our place.
Well, it's something that I mentioned in Proof of Heaven. I didn't make such a big deal of it there because there were other goals for that particular book that we had to be careful how far we tried to reach and stretch in taking the public along. But it was clear to me from my journey that this awakening, and it's an awakening that I see a very profound nature that I think we've been building towards for at least 5,000 years of human history. So this is not a little awakening like at the end of a decade or two of research on the brain, but a major awakening that I think will make the Copernican revolution look like child's play. Mm-hmm. But it was crystal clear to me on that journey that a huge part of that awakening is being fueled because we are capable of joining a much bigger club, the kind of off-planet club of advanced civilization, but we cannot do it as a primitive, warring, violent, conflicted, barbaric society, yes, which is exactly what we are today. Mm-hmm. And, when we go around and talk about how important love is, the unconditional love has infinite power to heal. And I know some people look at me and say, but we've always known that love is important. Well, guess what? We haven't lived it.
Right.
And this world must live it to join that much bigger club, which I believe is made up of advanced civilizations that are far, far more mature and loving, accepting, nurturing, cultivating, concerned. They really... it's an incredible kind of vision that I saw on my coma journey of where this is all headed, which I think is similar to information that's been coming to this world in various different forms to different people in different ways for thousands of years. But I believe that kind of awakening is what we're really facing here. So it's not just humanity learning much more about kind of the deep truths of living on this planet as, the human race and life on planet Earth, but that it has to do with really joining that far bigger club. Mm-hmm. And we really must mature. We have to grow up. We couldn't possibly survive that kind of a first contact, unless we can go through a lot of steps very rapidly to mature as a sentient civilization. If we want to call ourselves a civilization, we still have some tremendous strides to make in that effort. And I believe we're doing that. Yes. I believe that's what this awakening is all about. And it is also about a rejection of the simplistic nonsense of materialism. Materialism, in scientific terms, is a very dangerous notion. When you look at the divorce between science science and technology versus the evolution of human spirit. They divorced in the 20th century. The chemists committed their sin as scientists in World War I with the development of high explosives and poison gases. The physicists committed their sin as scientists in World War II with the development of nuclear weapons. Now, if we ever have a World War III, I promise you that World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. So obviously, we don't want to let science make any more mistakes of being divorced from the higher faculties of human reason that should protect us from the insanity and excesses of our science gone berserk. Mm-hmm. When you spend $1.2 billion a day on the U.S. military, which is able to go out there and destroy the world in ways that nobody could have ever dreamed possible, mm-hmm. I think our dollars and our intellectual capacity has been misaligned. Mm-hmm. And it is time to put them back together. Right. To have the highest sensibilities of humanity, of being here to take care of each other, realizing that this is really all much more about love, compassion, forgiveness, acceptance, and mercy than about military defeat of our enemies and about all the craziness of our fake news. And I can't even believe that we're marching closer to a potential nuclear exchange when we should be abolishing all nuclear weapons worldwide. This is insanity of the highest order. I mean, remember mutually assured destruction, MAD. There's no accident behind that acronym. And why we could even be taking steps towards nuclear war when all civilized, sane people on Earth for the last few decades have realized what we really need to do is get rid of nuclear weapons, get rid of all this focus on warfare and violence and conflict. That's what we have to do. Mm-hmm. If we want to awaken as human beings. And that's what this major awakening is really all about.
Well, to your argument, Eben, there has been repression of truth. There has been a limited story that the populace has been told since probably recorded history. I mean, we've not really fully been able to appreciate, be entrained from the time that we're born and we're young into a more holistic worldview of what we are as sovereign souls, what we have as the capacity to evolve in our own humanity and individually and collectively as a species into something that can ascend beyond just the Earth sphere that we happen to be on. But we are finally experiencing some really big breakthroughs. I think disclosure is upon us. I think a lot more disclosure is coming down the pike, and I'm welcoming and looking forward to that, and plan on having Solutionary TV being very key to our listeners and viewers to be able to provide that to them. But let's talk again, and I want to circle back to the brilliant work of Sacred Acoustics, because as one who meditates quite a bit and have always had some evolved intuitive gifts in my life and also in my practice, I still deal with the fact that there is a chaotic soup that we all live in, that I live in. Electromagnetic frequencies, so many things going on with various wave and interruptive frequencies, scalar waves to the brain, the chaos just of all the technology and society, the energy we feel off of one another because we can feel, of course, intensity, anxiety, stress, overwork, disillusionment. When we think about what it takes to really quiet the monkey mind and get into a sacred practice and a discipline of meditation, we really do need tools, don't we, Eben? And I know that when you chose and you partnered with Karen Newell to create a tool and a discipline for yourselves, it was also based on a goal that could get you personally into a more transcendent state, into those higher spheres, so that you could rejoin or have some confirmation in communicating with your father that had passed. And that was very personal. You talked about that in at least 2 of your books. And that touches the heart, and it gives a resonance for many as to it isn't just another thing to add to their calendar. I should be meditating. I should be doing yoga. I need to hit the gym, right? We're really talking about accessing the truth of who we are, and we may have very unique and personal reasons for doing so. So let's touch on what really spurned growing and evolving Sacred Acoustics with some of the the specific recordings. My favorite, I think, still is Cosmic Womb right now. I can just listen to that
yeah.
all day long. But let's talk about what gift you have given the populace when they choose to allow that type of a supportive tool enter into their meditative practice and consciousness expansion.
Well, I think I would start by pointing out, once you realize that the brain is not the creator of consciousness, but that consciousness is fundamental, is universal, and is allowed in through the filtering mechanism of the brain, then you start to realize, well, maybe going into consciousness is a good way to develop a much broader relationship with this universe. And yes, it is. Now, I was first introduced to this whole concept of differential frequency brain entrainment, or binaural beats, which is exactly what we're talking about from a technical perspective, about 2 years after my coma. And there were people who had been working in that field for a long time who came to hear a talk that I gave at the University of Virginia to Vision and Perceptual Studies. And they were the ones who kind of educated me to the notion of using slightly different frequencies to the 2 ears. And let me tell you a little bit more about how that works, because it is important for your listening audience to understand why this has anything to do with consciousness, and especially expanded transcendental forms of consciousness. It turns out this binaural beat phenomenon of 2 slightly different frequencies going to the 2 ears was discovered by a Prussian physicist named Heinrich Wilhelm Dove back in the mid-1800s. And what he found was that, for example, if you put a pure tone, 100 hertz, 100 cycles per second, as an example, in one ear, and a slightly different frequency, say 104 hertz, 104 cycles per second, in the other ear, that in the brain somehow there's generated a 4 hertz signal. That is, the arithmetic difference between those 2 input signals becomes the dominant driving signal somewhere in the brain. Turns out that is generated in the lower brainstem, in a place called the superior olivary complex. Turns out that that is linked to the ignition system for consciousness in the lower brainstem in a set of circuits that evolved more than 300 million years ago in evolutionary neurobiology. That was a time when reptiles, amphibians were just crawling out of the muck, long before mammals had come on the scene. So we're talking about a very early kind of evolutionary neurobiological time point where these circuits evolved. And those are the circuits that we're actually in training through these sacred acoustics techniques. Because by using those slight differences in sound frequency, we start modulating that lower brainstem so that it then influences all of the thalamocortical loops, the connections between the neocortex, the human part of the brain, and the deeper thalamic structures are all modulated by this very ancient brainstem structure. And that is something that we can actually start to manipulate through differential sound frequency. So when you listen to sacred acoustics, you may hear this kind of wah, 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 wavering kind of sound in the that you think is in the background, but that is actually, if you listen through headphones, can have tremendous power in liberating your consciousness from the shackles of the brain and the illusion of the here and now and the illusion of selfhood. And that's where all of this gets interesting, is when you listen to these sacred acoustics tones, they enable you to put that little voice in your head, the voice of the ego, the little voice that uses fear and anxiety as its main tools, and it lets you put those little thoughts and anxieties and egotistical concerns and acknowledge them as a tiny little itty-bitty voice that can be set aside over in the corner somewhere and just let it go, because those thoughts are not really very important. We're talking much more about developing a relationship with that mysterious aspect of consciousness, which is the self-awareness, and allowing that to communicate more fully with the creative source of the universe, with that God force, the same consciousness that I encountered deep in my coma that was so critical to my kind of understanding. And that is something that each and every one of us can develop in a far more robust fashion. And by doing so, modern science is coming to realize that this move towards mindfulness, towards meditation, towards going within, silencing that little voice of the ego, the little voice of the thoughts, but realizing that our conscious awareness can have a much more profound influence on our health, on our physical health, not only of my health, but also of the health of loved ones through prayer. We can use these various forms of developing a stronger relationship with that creative source to help in guidance, coming to see meaning and purpose in our lives, coming to really have a determining influence on uh, everything that occurs in our lives. So placebo effect is just the superficial level. That's, the, oh my God, materialist science is wrong because mind over matter can lead to people resolving and getting rid of their own cancer or infection or things like that. But placebo effect is just the beginning. All other aspects of our lives can also be influenced by a broader connection with that universal mind. And that's why I would say it is so important to develop a daily practice of meditation. And,
Right.
if you only have 10 or 20 minutes, fine, go with it. Just spend those moments going within. Sacred Acoustics is a beautiful way to do this just because it's such a powerful tool. But really, any way you have of silencing the little voice through transcendental meditation, other meditative techniques, uh, is wonderful. I've simply found great personal success and know of hundreds of other people who've had great success through Sacred Acoustics. So I would certainly encourage your listening audience, if they don't have a preferred mode of going within and of expanding their conscious awareness, but are looking for tools that are very powerful, I would suggest go to sacredacoustics.com. Karen has several very wonderful instructional videos there available on her website, all entirely for free. In addition, a free 20-minute download. Listen to that through headphones. Follow the instructions in her videos, and you'll start seeing what we're talking about. But these are all beautiful ways of connecting with souls of departed loved ones, of gaining much richer connection with our higher soul, coming to see the meaning and purpose in our lives, how we are to make decisions and choices, but also in healing, in ramping up our immune system, in overcoming a certain illness that we might have in the moment. These are all ways that this kind of meditative process going within can have tremendous power in terms of manifesting the world of our dreams.
Yes, absolutely. And I would like to circle back on what you mentioned about being able to contact or be connected with our loved ones that have passed. I don't think that there's anyone that has lost someone close to them that did not recognize the preciousness of time that they may have missed, opportunities that they are not going to have again, and not necessarily that they're not going to be able to be in the presence with or feel that everlasting spirit of that being, but that they need some degree of communication and closure, as you did with your father. I know I've had a personal experience that was so deeply powerful that when I was in a very receptive state, and that was the right sights, the right sounds, it was the right openness that I was experiencing, I had a grandfather come to me, and he came to me in the ways that you would hear Michael Newton talk about in some of his work, the smell, the sense, the tone, the voice, everything about the frequency that I would have identified as my grandfather, it just overwhelms you with knowing and familiarity. And of course, I was brought to tears. I have a colleague that recently lost a daughter in a very painful way. There was a theft that led to a murder. And unfortunately, they're dealing with all the things that many have to after dealing with our current legal system and cleaning up the mess and making sense out of it. Let's talk a little bit about how Sacred Acoustics was used by you and by others that you have worked with that have done the 33-day program, or those that have reached out to you, to be able to get communication, clarity, and a really intimate sense of peace of those that they've lost beyond the veil, because that's really, I think, going to be a big driving force for a lot of our viewers as well, Eben.
Well, I think you're exactly right. It's a very good point. In fact, as common as near-death experiences are, and the estimates are that probably somewhere between 15 and 20 million people in our country have had some form of a near-death experience. But they pale in numbers compared to after-death communications. After-death communications, I think, are probably the most common means of people realizing that we're far more than our physical bodies and that our connection does not end with the death of the physical body. I've heard from thousands of people who have attended my talks, who have emailed me or read Proof of Heaven and gotten back to me about this, that the most beautiful gift that they ever received from a loved one who has left the physical plane was an absolute certainty through some kind of communication, either around the time of their passage or afterwards, that they were still there. And and it comes in a form that is far beyond just thinking, oh, was that imagination? Was that my wishful thinking? Because they show us in no uncertain terms the absolute reality of their ongoing existence. Now, for me, as people, as you've been alluding to in this conversation, and as people who have read Proof of Heaven will realize, for me, a deep mystery of my own journey was the fact that my father, who was an academic neurosurgeon, very influential to me in my life. Both my parents were, and my sisters too. I mean, I had a wonderful family growing up, but they were all of tremendous import to me. But obviously, I followed in the footsteps of my father. So he was a tremendous mentor. He was very spiritual. He believed in a loving personal God. He believed in the power of prayer, but he was also very scientific. I mean, he was a chairman of a neurosurgical training program. He had to be scientific. For him, there was never any kind of conflict, though. His spirituality, his knowing of the reality of God and power of prayer, and that love had such a profound influence on our lives, that was all stuff he knew all through his life and never questioned. Now, he passed over 4 years before my coma in 2004. And those who've read Proof of Heaven will realize he was nowhere to be found in my NDE, which, you know, I'd never read NDE literature before my coma, but you bet after my NDE, I wanted to read everything I could get my hands on.
You bet.
But I wrote everything about my own personal memories of my coma experience, 20,000 words. I wrote all that down before I read anything about near-death experiences. And that was all the brilliant advice of my son, Eben IV, who was majoring in neuroscience in college at the time I was in coma. And he told me, if you want this to be of value to anybody, you need to write down everything you can remember before you read anything about anyone else. And that was the best advice I ever received. So I have that gold mine, that database of my experience that's untainted by anyone else's experience. And I can always refer back to that in terms of questions of my journey. But the thing that is so important was my father was nowhere to be found. And the more I read about NDEs, which I started to do beginning about 6 weeks after my coma, after I had written down my own personal experience, I came to realize that my father should have been there. And not only that, who was that beautiful girl on the butterfly wing? As I describe her in much detail in Proof of Heaven, I described her within the first week or two of returning to this world to family and friends, but we were all kind of mystified at that time because I remembered her so perfectly, everything about her sparkling blue eyes and her broad smile and high cheekbones and high forehead, soft brown hair, everything about her, and knowing her so beautifully because her thoughts came telepathically into my awareness, and yet I had no idea who she was.
Right.
Now, that was a huge mystery. And of course, in Proof of Heaven, we get to the bottom of that mystery to some degree. And 4 months after my coma, I received that beautiful picture of my birth sister, who I'd never known because I was adopted. So I had a whole birth family out there that I'd never known. And that is all part of that whole huge story of Proof of Heaven. But then in Living in a Mindful Universe, we share much more of the story because it gets much deeper. And especially that beautiful business that you bring up about my father, because there was a meditation that I describe in great detail in Living in a Mindful Universe that occurred early in my meditative practice. In fact, it was in the first week or so that I began strongly pursuing differential sound frequency brain entrainment to get into deep states of conscious awareness that I had this experience. But it involved encountering my father. And I mean, I just have chills going up and down my spine, and it's this beautiful feeling of warmth in my heart to even begin to get back to that story. And of course, it's told more fully in Living in a Mindful Universe. But briefly, for your listening audience, I would explain that I went into this deep meditative space, and in that space, I was aware of seeing 2 men sitting at a table at a cafe. essentially. And I describe all this in much more detail in the book. It's a really beautiful story. But as I approached them from behind, from the side, I realized that one of the men was my father, and that recognition was shocking,
Yeah.
absolutely astonishing to me, because it was the first time, in more than 6 years, since he had passed over 4 years before my coma, more than 6 years that I had any awareness of his presence at all. And it was a beautiful awareness. And as often happens in these extraordinary journeys deep into expanded consciousness, the information comes to us in these incredible floods of data, what I call a thought ball. It all comes in complete. And the awareness with my father's presence in that deep meditation, as he turned and looked at me with this wink and this smile, that was just like a wink and a smile he would have given me when I was but a young lad, to teach me some deep lesson about life. Well, it came to me in that beautiful meditative trance and experience, using differential sound frequency, sacred acoustics kinds of tones. That awareness that absolutely I was on the right pathway, that it had everything to do with exploring consciousness, that our entire modern scientific understanding of brain, mind, and the relationship was completely wrong, that my understanding of consciousness as primordial was absolutely the right pathway. And I just cannot put into words how profound that kind of awakening and understanding was, especially with that heartfelt connection with my father. And he's gone on to become a leader in terms of my kind of mentors, my guides in that space. I mean, I frequently use sacred acoustics to return to my NDE. I try to meditate an hour or two daily.
Hmm.
And a lot of that effort, especially the more extended efforts, is all about developing my relationship with that universal mind, that God power of love. And with my birth sister, with my father, who I first got to know again, in that meditative experience, but have gotten to develop a much richer relationship with in recent years of meditation and profound insights into the nature of my own soul journey.
Hmm.
These explorations and using sacred acoustics, getting into deep transcendental levels of conscious awareness, have led me into the ability to even see kind of soul agreements that were made by grandparents, adoptive and birth family grandparents, that had to do with setting the stage for my very birth and my kind of journey of adoption, of abandonment, of all of the tough pieces of that early childhood that were such beautiful gifts, but only so in looking back on it and see how they played a role in my growth as a soul, coming to a deeper understanding of what I came here to learn, came here to teach, and what we're all in the process of learning and teaching and growing in together in this process of soul school. And
Yes.
I would say that going within sacred acoustics, that kind of style of very deep, profound intersection of consciousness in the lower brainstem to allow us to break free of the illusion of the here and now and of the self, is extraordinary in its power.
Yes.
That's why I would encourage people who haven't tried any form of meditation, now is the time to start.
Yes.
Get
Yes.
with it. And if your job involves any kind of creativity, if you want to have any kind of notion of meaning and purpose in life, where all this is going, and how you can better grow into manifesting that world of your dreams, of your higher soul, and of relationships with others, about helping this world to wake up, we're all in it together, and it involves seeking those answers that lie within. And the best way to do that by far is developing a meditative practice. And
Hmm.
over a period of months and years, your mind and your mental function begins to shift dramatically to reflect the benefits of that meditative practice, which is simply allowing that universal mind to help co-create the world of our dreams.
Yes. Oh, I'm just so enthusiastic about how beautifully you described that, because we know that so much of what is creating these wedges within society between individuals and with individuals that are turning on themselves with addictive behaviors has to do with this internal sense it's an illusion, but it is a very firm belief in isolation. We've believed in separateness for too long. We felt separate even from the atomic intelligence of our cells, the epigenetics that is now evolving and telling us a different story, the concepts of neuroplasticity, the advancements in consciousness, and these tools that they have really return us to the wholeness that we are and the connection that we have with the wholeness of not only humanity, but really cosmically, isn't it, Eben?
Right. And you know, the real tragedy of all that divorce of human spirit from science and technology in the 20th century was perpetuating that myth of separation. Because in fact, what is coming from the current understanding of brain-mind consciousness and this notion of universal mind is the idea that you don't want to hurt another because that is hurting yourself.
Exactly.
Because we're all parts of this one consciousness. This one mind is kind of evolving with itself, but it's like all the facets on a diamond are all the various sentient beings that are participating in this growth. But you're exactly right. You hit the nail on the head. One of the biggest problems is that false sense of separation that comes from a materialist scientific dogma, and in fact, the very reductive materialism that is the generic way of explaining that science is one of separation. And it's a false sense of separation. So we're really talking about a much grander evolution of consciousness, and that's something we're all part of. And it's really an acknowledgement of the oneness, that it's all bound together through love. And that is something that we are here to share and learn and grow with in this process of awakening that I would say is an absolutely part of human destiny when you look over the last 5,000 years.
Well, your tools are tried and true. Your books have been New York Times bestsellers, and Sacred Acoustics I can vouch for as a daily practice. Please tell our viewers, our listeners, where to find not only your books again, your website, and also Sacred Acoustics.
Well, please visit me at Eben Alexander. That's E-B as in Baker, ENAlexander.com. And right on that front page there is your invitation to the 33-day journey into the heart of consciousness, which is that free 33-day email course. Click there, leave your first name and email address, and we'll send you all the information you need every day in an email to help grow with us. Also, please visit sacredacoustics.com. That is Karen's website. She has a lot of instructional videos available there, a tremendous range of products, but also some free downloads that are very powerful. I would encourage you to go there to learn more. And we love staying in touch with our people, so hopefully people reach out to us on these websites. And we would encourage people to take advantage of the power of Sacred Acoustics. Just give it a try. You will be amazed how much sound it can do.
Yes.
Different frequency sound is an astonishingly powerful tool for opening the doors of transcendental conscious awareness. I mean, it shocks me no end. I can't help but smile over realizing how powerful this stuff is, and most people have no idea. And it's all too. That's the best thing.
Yeah. Well, like I said, it comes with a very strong recommendation from me. I'm naturally an intuitive, but the places that I am able to go when I am able to augment that brain chemistry and again allow for that expansiveness has been exponential. There's been no limit. It has been such a genuine pleasure having you tonight, Dr. Eben Alexander. Thank you so much for giving us the quality of your time and the witness that you have for this consciousness. I want to remind our viewers, this is an era of disclosure. We do have the tools to lift the burdens of humanity and bring us back into oneness. Visit us here at Solutionary TV, and remember that together, we are the solution.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Telestream's Wirecast software, StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.